The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, but I can't tell you why. Seasons spinning round again, the years keep rolling by.
In 1959, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned its ban on Lady Chatterley's Lover. In 1960, November 2nd, in England, Penguin Books won the lawsuit that had been brought against it. And on that same day, they sold 200,000 copies of the book. The ban was even lifted in Canada. It was decided there was something of literary merit about the book. It wasn't merely obscene. Well, I was a teenager at the time. And I knew that one day I would read all of D.H. Lawrence's novels, every word, every novel, because I passionately believed in freedom of the press. Well, a little while later, I went to McGill, and while I was there, a scandal broke. It seems that the prissy librarian in Royal Victoria College, the women's dorm where I lived, the librarian had taken scissors and cut out all the juicy parts of Lady Chatterley's Lover. Yeah. I mean, we were all in shock. After all, we were all mature adults. Some of us could even vote or drink. Well, Royal Victoria College is a big brick building with a giant statue of a mature Queen Victoria on the front steps. It used to be the women's college associated with McGill University when McGill University was all male. So it had better facilities than some, including that little library where the librarian had caused such a fuss on campus. I worked there. It was a good place to work. I liked to hang out in libraries. And working in the library inside the dorm meant that I didn't have to go outside in the snowy, cold Montreal winters. Well, one evening I was working there. I liked to work in the evenings when the librarian had gone home for the day. And I was putting away a stack of books. So I came to one book. It looked boring. I used to flip through each book before I put it away, just in case it was something interesting. This book looked boring. It had a brown cover. Ordinarily, I do not like books with brown covers. And it had a boring title, something philosophical, metaphysical, religious, the Kama Sutra. But just in case, I started flipping through it. Turns out, it was a book about sex positions. I checked it out. That night, I read the book, cover to cover. I was pure as the driven snow at the time, and I had no idea the human body could do those things. I told my friends about it. One by one, they all checked it out in the evening, after the librarian had gone home. We all assumed that she had no idea what she had bought. I mean, would she buy the Kama Sutra if she had cut the pages out of Lady Chatterley's Lover? My friends told their friends. And probably by the end of the semester, every girl in the women's dorm at Royal Victoria College had checked out the Kama Sutra and read it, cover to cover. When I look back on it, I'm inclined to think that Lady Chatterley's Lover, in its way, had broadened my educational horizons. Because in my determination to be a liberal, free-thinking person, I'd happened upon the Kama Sutra. Thank you.
You know, Paul Bunyan is from the Great Northwest. Pecos Bill is from the Southwest.
Texas.
Johnny Appleseed, Midwest. John Chapman from Ohio. John Henry is from the Great South. Where's the tall tale character from the Northeast? You know, and as a kid, I was really troubled by this. You know, this was disturbing to me. And so when Mrs. Flood, our second grade substitute teacher, told us, Mrs. Flood, she introduced herself, "My name is Mrs. Flood. When I walk down the street," where's that water when I need it?
Speaking of floods.
When I walk down the street with all my children walking behind me, the neighbors say, "There goes Mrs. Flood with all her little puddles." Now, students, I tell you that story so that you'll remember my name, Mrs. Flood. And more than 50 years later, I remember Mrs. Flood's name. So she told this story about Bill Greenfield, and she said Bill Greenfield was from upstate New York. And this, she had my attention. I mean, so here's the story she told. Bill decided that he was going to spend a whole year long up in the Adirondacks all by himself just to prove that it could be done. Now, that's no big challenge, spring, summer, fall, but the winter, of course, is the big challenge. Well, he started right off in the spring to get a good start, planted a garden, which attracted a lot of rabbits and deer, so he had plenty to eat, mostly rabbits and deer. But by the time winter came early that year, you know, September. And he had pretty much all he needed stored away. And boy, did it snow that year. You know, he had to tunnel his way out the front door, and there was no point to it because all he got was more snow. You know, look up at the snow roof. So he gave up on leaving the place, and he just stayed there himself, which was not a bad idea because it was so cold. You know how the Adirondacks get to be really cold, and probably everybody knows that it's so cold when you talk, the words just freeze in the air. So there's a real danger in the spring of hearing loss because people tend to talk louder so that the words go a little bit further before they freeze. And if they end up really shouting to try and be heard, then the words freeze. And in the spring, when it all saws at once, the noise is so much you can go deaf. So it's just as well you don't talk at all. Well, come April, there were still a few more weeks of winter to go, and he was out of food. So he had to go out, do a little hunting. And there was a stream close by which was still running. It hadn't frozen over because the water went so fast it never had time to freeze. He was afraid to dip anything into it because he figured it'd just freeze right up immediately. Anyway, he got out down the long rifle from on top of the mantelpiece. He rummaged around, only found one piece of lead shot, which was really all he needed. He took after his father Abner, just an excellent marksman, excellent hunter. Probably not as good as Abner, but anyway, he put the gunpowder in, he put the shot in, and went outside. And before long, you know, of course, it's so cold, he had to put on every stitch of clothing available in the cabin, including the waders, because he just needed that insulation. It was so cold. And he heads out, and before long, he spots a deer. And he's about ready to take aim, and then he sees there's another deer over there. And right in the middle, he sees this outcropping, where the stone underneath the ground, it's not much soil in the Adirondacks, it sticks right out, and there's a sharp edge to that outcropping. So he aims right for that sharp edge, shoots, the shot comes out, splits, and kills both deer. Well, that was great, but the kickback from that rifle was so strong it sent Bill on his back. He falls into the stream instantly. That water freezes inside his waders, and he lets out such a scream it goes up into the sky before it freezes right around a goose that happened to be flying by at that instant. The goose drops like a stone to the ground. Bill lurches himself out of the stream, grabs that goose, brings it into the cabin to have for dinner. It wasn't until then, in the heat of the stove cooking, that the ice in his waders melted, and that's when he became aware that he'd captured 2 brown trout and a mallard duck. And that was the first introduction I had to Bill Greenfield, the gall-darndest liar.
I stopped for gas in Canton, New York, just south of the Canadian border. This was my first day of my big adventure. I was planning to drive across the continent from Schenectady, New York, to Edmonton, Alberta, where my mother lived. Now, it was also going to be a trip of renewal, because I'd gone through some tough years. I was recently divorced. My kids were heading off to college. I had taken a new job in a new city, Schenectady, and I hadn't yet learned to love Schenectady. And I felt pretty bruised. But I was going to make this big trip alone and prove something to myself. I wasn't meeting with a lot of encouragement. My friends said, "Oh, we really don't think this is a good idea." I mean, my friend Judith said, "Margaret, what if the car breaks down and you're in the middle of nowhere? What if you get attacked by some maniac on the road?" My husband thought it was such a bad idea that he had convinced my younger son, who originally was going to go with me, that I should not go, and maybe I would give up this harebrained idea. He liked to say things like, "You'd never survive a day in the real world." So this trip had a lot of meaning for me. So I went to get my purse, which was supposed to be on the floor on the passenger side. It wasn't there. So I looked under the seat as best I could. Then I opened all 4 doors and checked every inch of the inside of my little Dodge hatchback. I opened up the back of the hatchback and I looked. There was my suitcase, a pillow, my emergency comforter, a little cooler, styrofoam cooler. There was no purse. Now, no purse, this meant no trip. You can't travel without photo ID, credit cards, cash, bank card, AAA card. It looked like my big trip was over. It would take days to get those cards replaced, and then I wouldn't have time to make the trip. It also looked like everything people had told me was right. I really wasn't capable of making a big trip like this. I mean, I hadn't even made it to the Canadian border. By chance, I had 600 pennies in a bin in my car. I'm not exactly sure why I had 600 pennies with me, but I convinced the woman in the convenience store gas station to accept pennies. She wasn't happy about it. And I put $6 worth of gas in my car, and I figured that would get me home. But there was nothing else I could do but head back towards Schenectady. And I felt pretty beaten. It was evening. I was supposed to go to Ottawa the first night, stay with my brother, and then head west towards the Trans-Canada. I called him from a payphone in a little strip mall. When I was driving in, I drove over some kind of barrier on the road that I hadn't seen in the dark, and I hoped I hadn't broken anything, but I wasn't going to look. My brother was very calm, and he said, "You know, Margaret, maybe it's all for the best. Nora and I were worried about you. We weren't so sure that this was a good idea." Well, I headed back. But I thought if I could find that purse on the way home, I could change my mind and I could take the trip. I would stop at every single place I'd stopped along the way. Now, I'd stopped to use the restrooms on the beach in Long Lake. So I stopped there and I looked in the ladies' room, round every single stall and every single sink, and I went all around the building, and I went on every inch of the parking lot, and I talked to all the people around it. Nobody had seen a purse. I stopped at Haas's General Store in Long Lake because I'd bought souvenirs there. It was almost closing time. Nobody was in the store but the proprietor. He was a big man with a beard, serious flannel shirt. I thought he looked like a Adirondack version of Moses. He was very kind. He helped me look in every inch of that store. We looked in every single display. We looked on every shelf. We looked on every windowsill. We looked under everything in that store. It wasn't there. So trying to be helpful, he did one last thing. He said, "Let us pray. Dear Lord, please help this woman find her purse. Amen." Nothing left to do then but head home. By this time it was dark, and it started to rain, and there was a thunderstorm, and I was tired. And Route 30 is a very windy, twisty road with uphills and downhills, and I didn't want to drive it at night in the dark, in a thunderstorm. I had no money for a motel, so for the first time in my life, I slept in my car. I pulled into a rest stop by Indian Lake. Really, it was just a pull off the road. It was pouring rain. But I went to my cooler and I made myself a sandwich. Peanut butter and Indian pickles on cracked wheat bread. It's my own recipe. It's not bad, but I haven't shared it with the general public yet. And I had my emergency blanket and I had my emergency pillow. Put them in the back seat. Now, my car was the cheapest model available. It had no air conditioning. It had no radio. But I did have an audio cassette player. And I had the tapes of William Least Heat Moon, Blue Highways, his story about driving around the back roads of America. And I thought it was perfect for this trip. And it was. Now, my audio cassette player only had one level. It was either off or it was way too loud. But I put it on way too loud anyway, and I went in the back seat, and to my great surprise, I fell asleep. I woke up early the next morning, and I thought about having to tell my friends that I hadn't even made it to the Canadian border. And I drove home, and I got home early. I dragged my suitcase up the stairs to my apartment. I went to my answering machine. There was one message. The red light was blinking. It was a message from a woman in Oneida, New York, who had stopped at the restrooms on the beach in Long Lake, and she had found my purse. Oneida. Oneida, that's close to Syracuse. I could change my plans. I could go to Syracuse, head north on 81, and then head west. My trip was on. So I told her I'd meet her later that morning. We met at a Friendly's in Oneida. She was there with her boyfriend. And both she and her boyfriend, they listened to me tell all about my trip and what I wanted to do and why I wanted to do it and why it was so important to me. And they said, take your purse and check it. Check everything. Look at your wallet. It's all there. Well, I knew it was all there. I would have trusted those people with my life, but I checked it so they would know that I knew it was all there. I wanted to give them a reward. They absolutely refused. I wanted at least to buy them lunch, and they refused. They said, we were going out for lunch anyway. But I think it was deeper than that. I think they truly wanted to do something good. And they wanted to make it possible for me to go on my trip because they could tell it mattered a lot to me. It was a good trip west. It was full of small adventures that were important to me. And I learned a couple of important things. I learned that there are good people out there. And I learned that I was going to make it. I was going to be okay. Thank you.
Well, so I wouldn't want to leave you with just one impression of Bill Greenfield's prowess as an Adirondack character. And of course, I assumed that, like Paul Bunyan and Pecos Bill, he was just a made-up character. But as I read more stories, and I'd see one collection or another, I came across something that said that he was from the town of Edinburgh, which is in Saratoga County. So that was consistent with upstate New York and, Adirondack character and stuff like that. But I still wasn't convinced that he was a real person, and I'll leave that as the cliffhanger for today. But one story that I came across that actually had an introduction that said that he was buried in the Clarkville Cemetery. Now, again, if you're going to establish credibility for a tall tale, this is, he's in the town of Edinburgh. Right, it's Clarkville Cemetery. I didn't even know at the time if there was a place called Clarkville or a Clarkville Cemetery. So he made some of his living as an Adirondack guide. And he had a particular customer from New York City who would come up periodically, a couple times a year even, and go hunting and fishing. They became very good friends. And over the campfire one night, this fellow from New York City is bragging about the really terrific restaurants in New York City, and it's such a shame, Bill, that you live up here in the woods and there's no restaurants like that. And I'll tell you, my favorite meal in one of those restaurants is frog's legs, and they're mighty expensive. You couldn't probably afford them, Bill, but it's the best meal you ever had. And Bill looks at him, askance. I don't do askance very well. He looks askance. He says, "What, you pay for frog's legs? Well, you come up here in the spring, and I'll get you all the frog's legs you can eat." Well, the guy can't resist, so he schedules a visit with Bill, and he comes up the following spring, and they head out when it's still dark out. Cold morning, The ice has left the lakes and ponds, but it's very chilly. And Bill tells this guy, now you lay down here on the ground next to this little pond, and they can hear the frogs croaking around the pond. And he says, you take this rock, and he hands him a good hand-sized rock, and he says, now, when I give you the signal, you take that rock and you smash it down on this boulder. And here's this, you can just see the crown of this boulder coming up over the grass. When I give you the signal, you smash that hand rock into that boulder. And Bill stands there, and he's got this big, long, sharp knife in his arm that he's holding out. And they're just kind of poised like that, and it's dark, and you can see the sun beginning to creep up over the horizon. Now you know that scientifically, that's how Bill would say it, scientifically, you know that it's coldest just after the sun rises, because all night long on a cloudless night like tonight, the earth is radiating out heat, and once the sun comes up, the earth is still losing heat until the sun is strong enough to have a net heat gain. It's coldest after sunrise. And so they're waiting there. And finally, just as the sun is coming up, Bill gives the signal, and this guy from New York City, he takes that hand rock and he pounds the boulder in the ground and makes this great thud, and the ground vibrates. And all the frogs that are grouped around the pond jump into the water just as a thin film of ice forms over the little pond. And Bill takes his razor-sharp knife and skims it along the ice, and those little frog legs stuck in the ice, all cut off. They had a nice meal of frog's legs for breakfast. I told you it was a little more violent.
So at the zoo, my friend Lynn was the person who knew most about the gorillas, except for their keeper, Dave Linehan. Yes. And I loved on my lunch hour to go and watch Lynn talk to people about the gorillas. And she taught people to not look them directly in the eye and how to approach them properly. And most of the time, 99% of the time, she got a great response. And so the female gorillas would play patty cake with children, and people would sit in front of them, and no one would look directly at the silverback, and nobody would be frightened, and they wouldn't fly at the glass and bounce off it and thump their chest. But every once in a while, somebody would show up. And I have to say, it was always a man, who would thump his chest as loud as he could, which was an automatic trigger for the adult silverback to run at the glass and defend the women and children in his troop. And sure enough, on this particular day, during my lunch hour, a fellow did it. And Lynn said to him, please don't do that. It alarms the gorillas. It angers the silverback. Come on, he doesn't care. And so the very quick version is he walked from this large plexiglass plate overlook to an open overlook around the corner. And Lynn grabbed me by the arm and said, come with me. At the same time, she called security. And so we get around the overlook, and it's this vast, wide expanse with a moat and a very deep fence. And the guy is thumping, and the African tropical forest in the Franklin Park Zoo echoes. You know, when the pumas roar, it echoes. And when the gorillas, when this guy says, whoa, blah, 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 it's echoing and reverberating. And the gorilla is hooting and clearly really distressed. It would be like someone coming into my house, and doing this. And the guy just is laughing, and he thought it was hysterical. And all of a sudden, Lynn grabbed me again and said, move back. And very calmly. And I thought with great dignity, the gorilla kind of squatted, shat in his hand, took aim, and got the guy right in mid, boom. It was all I could do to fall over. I laughed so hard, I slid down the wall and ended up crying. Lynn was hysterical, waiting for the security guy to come to throw the guy out, and the man was furious at us. Why are you laughing? You should be getting me a paper towel. I'm going to sue the zoo. For what? And I don't have any paper towels. He walked off swearing. Security escorted him off. But I thought, sometimes some animals may not need our intervention. So there. I'm very fond of that story.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, but I can't tell you why. Seasons spinning round again, the years keep rolling by.